number 5.1 is a minor variance A-22-19.48. This is for the PHW Family 2013 Holdings with municipal address of 146 High Street in the former town of Southampton. Ms. Fortier.
Thank you. So this is a property located in Southampton at the intersection of High Street and Grosvenor Street. So you likely all know it as the Walker House in Southampton, the restaurant. And so the Walker House are proposing an addition to their building. So it involves demolishing a portion of the existing building, about 138 square meters, and then adding on to that area plus an additional area for a total addition of 406 square meters. So overall, the building size will increase from about 680 square meters to 950 square meters. And so in order to permit this, a minor variance is required for lot coverage. So this property is within the core commercial area of Southampton. The maximum lot coverage in the bylaw is 50%, and the applicants are requesting a 65% lot coverage. So basically, on page 5, you'll see the outline of the proposed addition, the existing building, which is proposed to remain largely intact. There's a kind of diamond-shaped hatched area. That's what's proposed to be demolished, and then the area with just the straight lines across, that's what's proposed to be built. And so, as you can see on the site plan, it really just squares off the existing building at the rear so that you won't have any visual impact at the front. In terms of the policies, there's no real issues from a provincial policy statement point of view in this one. It's really in line. In terms of the local official plan, the subject lands are core commercial and are subject to the Special Area 2 policy. Now, Special Area 2 is just for limited heights in certain areas of Southampton. It doesn't really apply to the core commercial area, so we don't really have to worry about that special policy. In terms of the core commercial, this is an area that's meant to recognize the historic downtowns of Port Elgin and Southampton, and these areas intended as the commercial focal points for the town. Restaurants are a permitted use, so there's no issues from an official plan standpoint for this proposal. In terms of the zoning bylaw, it is zoned Core Commercial Special 2. So the special provisions in this case really relate to the existing building. It has 0-meter setbacks because, as you know, it does come right up to the sidewalk. So it really just recognizes the existing setbacks for the building, as well as frontage and lot area, as it is slightly undersized as per the core commercial zone. So none of the current special provisions are impacted by the proposed development. This one is really just for lot area. The proposed building would have a total lot coverage of approximately 59%, but they are requesting a little bit of wiggle room, so a 65% lot coverage. There are also some sheds on the property that are less than 10 square meters, but do contribute to the coverage. So the addition, as mentioned, is proposed to the rear. There's no issues in terms of setbacks. The rear yard setback, kind of where the parking area is off the patio of 6 meters, that will continue to be met. And I don't imagine there'll be any other impact, so I do believe that the variance meets the intent of the zoning bylaw, despite the increased coverage. In terms of town comments, there were no objections from the town of Saugeen Shores, although they did note that there will be further review through the site plan control process. There were no issues raised by any of the other circulated agencies. There were some public comments received. Those aren't noted in the report as they were submitted after the deadline, but you should have received them on your agenda. Their concerns were largely to do with parking and the increased area, meaning that there'll be increased parking needed by the Walker House. Now, it should be noted that in the core commercial areas, businesses are not required to provide parking. The expectation is that parking will be provided via street parking as well as municipal lots. So this really isn't impacted. The existing use isn't impacted by any parking requirements, and generally the downtowns should provide enough parking for all the businesses. The other noted concern raised by in the comments received from the public had to do with servicing being available and how if the if the proposal would impact servicing, and none of the circulated agencies raised any concerns with the proposal being able to receive enough water, sewer, utilities, any of that. So there's no concerns from a servicing point of view. In terms of the 4 tests of the variance, I've gone through the first 2 for compliance with the official plan and the zoning bylaw. No issues there, in my opinion. In terms of test 3, is it desirable and appropriate? I believe that it is. This addition will largely allow for 2 things for the Walker House. For one, it will allow for an expansion to the existing kitchen. So the kitchen is undersized, does not currently meet their needs. So it will allow for an expansion, which will allow them to cater and host larger events in some of their space, their existing space. And the other one is it will allow for a new washroom to be installed that will be accessible. The existing washroom on the ground floor on the western side of the building is not accessible. It does not meet the needs of their patrons, so this will allow for a fully accessible washroom to also be built. So those are the 2 main things that this addition will help with, as well as providing some additional dining areas, but it's mostly the washroom and the kitchen expansion. So is the variance minor? I believe that it is. The proposed addition will essentially square off the building at the rear. There won't be any impact from visual impact on the street or on the historic character of the building, and I don't imagine this increase in coverage will impact the ability of neighboring property owners or municipalities or the municipality to use the property for permitted uses. So I do recommend approval.
Thank you. Do the applicants wish to address the committee? I don't think so. I guess if it arises, committee discussion. Councillor Rich.
Thank you, through you, Mr. Chair. My question isn't with regard to the application itself. I was looking at the written comment that we received, and I guess the question is probably to Tessa. So they make note in their last paragraph that notice was mailed on May 8th, received on May 13th, and submissions had to be due by May 14th. I do feel that they're correct that that's probably an unreasonable amount of time, although I have no objections to anything with regard to the minor variance. I just would like to address that and ask if there's any way in which we could give people more ample time to respond.
Yeah, so for a minor variance, the circulation, the notice period is 10 days. So in the Planning Act, so it is relatively short because these are generally minor applications. So it is 10 days. We did meet that. However, it is something I noted, and we are working on a communications overview at the county level. So all of our notices, all of our communications are being looked at. So this will be sent to the team working on that as something to note and how we might be able to address that. So it has been noted.
Deputy Mayor Matheson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and through you, I think this is a good use of the land, knowing the Walker House set up the way it is. It's not going to infringe upon any of the buildings around it. It has the Legion parking lot behind it, and I fully support this.
Thank you. Councillor Grace.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I also support this application. I think that the owners of the Walker House have done a great job so far in all the renovations, and I'm thanking them for continuing their investment in our community.
Thank you. Any further questions, comments? Therefore, I have a motion moved by Mr. Reid and seconded by Deputy Mayor Matheson, dated today, May the 21st, 2019, that minor variance application A-22-19.48 be approved, subject to the following conditions: that the maximum lot coverage be no more than 65% of the lot area, that any future development on the property conforms to the provisions of the zoning bylaw, and that the decision applies only to the proposed development as indicated on Schedule A attached to the decision sheet and forming part of this decision. All in favor? That is carried. Thank you. Our next hearing is number 5.2. It's minor variance A-23-19.44. This is Skyline Real Estate Holding Incorporated, and with the municipal address of the former town of Port Elgin of 1043 Waterloo Street. Mr. Kingsley.
Okay, thank you very much. So these lands are just across the road there as part of the Summerside subdivision development. They are block 59, I believe, as part of that development. The application is seeking relief from the maximum density provisions of the zoning bylaw. Currently 90 hectares per acre are allowed. A variance in 2018, last August, was approved to increase that to 93 units per hectare, which allowed 108 units. And subsequently, the applicant is seeking to convert 2 amenity space areas, which have been deemed redundant, into units to increase the units to 110 in total. So 2 more than are actually permitted right now, which equates to 94 units per hectare. So they're seeking relief from that provision, and then the additional units necessitate changes in the parking provisions. So they're also seeking relief from the total number of parking spaces from 212 to 211, and they're also seeking to relief from the number of accessible parking spaces by combining 4 of the 7 allotted accessible spaces to be dual-purpose visitor accessible parking spaces. And the way that would work is through a combination of signage and permitting, where residents with a disability who require that parking would have priority over a visitor and would be assigned that particular parking spot. So in terms of public comments, none were received. The town comments were that the site plan will need to be revised to address parking, and the applicant is required to ensure there is sufficient parking at all times. In terms of the PPS, it's my opinion that is consistent with the PPS. In terms of the town's official plan, Section 3.4.3.2.1 establishes a maximum density of 90 units per hectare. So as I noted, this development represents 1 block of 3 blocks, high-density residential blocks within that plan of subdivision. So spread across the 3 blocks, the proposed development maintains that 90 unit per hectare density requirement across the Summerside subdivision development. So that necessarily means that later on down the road, a subsequent high-density block will be developed to a lesser density by 1 unit. So in terms of the official plan and zoning bylaw, these are the 4 tests. I think we've covered those in terms of what provisions relief are being sought from. In terms of test 3, is the proposed variance desirable and appropriate? I feel the proposed variance is appropriate. The subject lands have already undergone a comprehensive planning process through an official plan amendment, zoning bylaw amendment, and plan of subdivision approval process. Moreover, the proposed variance maintains the intent of the planning exercise that established those lands as high-density residential, and it also maintains the function of the lands as high-density residential. And as noted, site plan control is applicable to the lands. Is it minor? I would suggest that the proposal is minor in nature. It's increasing the total number of units permitted on the lot from 108 to 110 without changing the overall form of the buildings. And the proposed parking solution is adequate, and the relief being sought is minor, in my opinion. So with that, my recommendation is to approve the variance as proposed.
Thank you. Does the applicant wish to address?
Thank you, staff and committee. My name is Matthew Robson. I'm here on behalf of my client, Skyline Developments. I concur with staff's recommendations. I reviewed their staff report. Just to provide some additional information, back in the fall when the previous variance was sought for additional density, they were still going through the detailed design of the buildings, and they hadn't necessarily contemplated this central amenity building at that point. So given there's now a central amenity building to serve all three buildings, it doesn't really make sense for them to have small individual amenity units in each building. So that's why they've realized it makes a better use of the land to make those residential suites. It's quite common in other municipalities as well to count the barrier-free spaces as visitor parking, given those visiting the building will be using them typically. In the event that someone requires a barrier-free space and they're a resident, Skyline would be required to identify another space on the site plan as a visitor parking space. So you wouldn't be deficient in that respect. I'm happy to answer any questions of the committee, though.
Thank you. Deputy Mayor Matheson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Through you, you're increasing the units by 2, but decreasing the parking by 1. Why is that?
So through you, Chair, the number of parking spaces is not changing on the site. The actual parking requirement is an additional, I guess it's 2.5 spaces based on 2 additional units. It's 1.25 per unit. So there was a surplus previously, and now they're just short 1 based on the current units being proposed. So the actual site plan is not changing. We're just requesting the ability to not count as many visitor parking spaces and basically identify those as unit dedicated spaces versus visitor. Hope that's clear. Yeah.
Thank you. Oh, Councillor Grace.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a question about the dual-use visitor and accessible model that you're proposing. I guess I'm interested in how this would practically work. Are tenants given the opportunity to identify themselves as needing an accessible spot? Would they have a reserved accessible spot for them? Would you have a limit on the number? I've got about 4 questions, so
Sure.
I'll start off with that. I'm really interested in, practically speaking, how that's going to be monitored and fairly handled.
Sure. Through you, Mr. Chair. So the zoning bylaw requires a certain number of barrier-free spaces to be provided on the site. That's 6.1, or if you round it up to 7 spaces. So the overall site, we're providing 7 spaces as barrier-free. If these are simply dedicated to units, you won't have that many people in each building who require a barrier-free space. So the idea is to show them as visitor. However, should someone require it, you're going to then transfer that visitor space somewhere else on the property. So I think the zoning establishes what you need for the site being 7, and how that's divvied up. It'll be on a case-by-case basis, I'm sure, but in theory, you could, if someone requires an additional barrier-free space over and above the site plan, you could come in for a red line amendment and request that to be changed as well, to add, say, two spaces, should you require more.
Yes.
Follow up and
that might have just been too much information.
No, that's good. Just to clarify then, so what you're saying is if it turned out that you had 6 people who lived there who required a barrier-free space, that you could provide those designated spaces for them, and then you would then be using some of the other spaces to fill up the required visitor spaces?
Through you, Mr. Chair, that's correct.
Okay. Will any of those accessible spaces be big enough to accommodate a mobility van?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I believe they are. They're all type A spaces. Type B space is the smaller space.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Anyone else? No? I have a motion moved by Councillor Rich and seconded by Deputy Mayor Matheson, dated today, May the 21st, 2019. That minor variance application A-23-19.46 be approved subject to the following conditions. That relief from provisions 10-3A and 10-3I in the zoning bylaw to permit a maximum density of 94 units per hectare on the subject lands be granted. That relief from provisions 3.24.2 and 3.24.3 in the zoning bylaw to permit 211 parking spaces, including 4 combined visitor accessible parking spaces, to be granted. That any future development on the property conforms to the provisions of the zoning bylaw, and that the decision applies only to the proposed development as indicated on Schedule A attached to the decision sheet informing this part of the decision. All in favor? That is carried. Thank you. Our next meeting date will be Monday, June the 17th, and I have a motion here, it's right here, moved by Deputy Mayor Matheson and seconded by Mr. Reid, dated today, May the 21st, 2019, that we do now adjourn to meet again at the call of the Secretary Treasurer. All in favor? Thank you, everyone.